Okay, thanks very much. As you will see here, I intended to speak about opening up a new perspective, but given the discussion that particularly this morning, but partly also yesterday afternoon, I think it's more a complementary perspective to many of the things that have already been said. So in that sense, I think it fits very well. So I'll say a few things about growing inequality, which is the background against which I see my work and this presentation. Then discuss a bit the concept of in-work poverty, the growing complexity in labor market, economy, further society surrounding the place where you find in-work poverty, and then go on with the distribution of workers over households and what I view as one of the consequences of that distribution, increased inter-household job competition, which may leave people out or with very few hours at the low-skilled end of the workers' distribution, and then some policy conclusions or implications. So both the Top Incomes project, think about Thomas Piketty and others, but before his capital, the OECD's studies, literally on growing inequalities or growing unequal, and the Gini research projects, which I coordinated across 30 countries on growing inequalities, impacts, so that's the acronym Gini is on impacts. We all find growing inequalities over the recent decades in many countries, not necessarily in all countries all the time, but the general trend is upward, and I think we need to take that into account. But even if this inequality is not moving much, there is a lot of tectonics underneath that aggregate inequality, and particularly I think that labor incomes are becoming more important towards the top of the income distribution. You see their role very clearly spelled out in top incomes for the US, but also for other countries. So not only are they high up already, but they also seem to be moving up in many cases. And then I think with this whole story, even if you're talking about in-work poverty, people have a job or some kind of job. There's also household joblessness, which may also be a consequence of the processes that are going on. So people who draw a nil in the jobs and hours lottery. So this picture gives you the idea for EU countries at the end of the 2000s, where you find households with their main income received from labor earnings in the income distribution. So on the x-axis you have the 10 deciles, and you see there's a strong concentration of these households towards the higher end, and at the bottom, like Romania, only 4% of the households at the bottom, in the bottom decile, have main earnings from labor, but most have a bit more. But particularly Estonia, almost 100% of all the households in the top decile are labor earning households. There is some interesting variation, but I can't discuss it. This serves to show you how important these households are for the income distribution. The other thing, as I mentioned, joblessness, is this growing divide, but this is an extreme example, but here I would find the longest run series. This is the UK. You see the red line on top is the personal employment to population ratio, so that has increased to some 78% in the mid-2000s, while at the same time, certainly there in the 1980s, 1990s, the household employment rate, so the percentage of households in that particular age group, like the individuals as well, has been going down, and there is an increasing divergence, which means that much of the increase in individual employment has gone to households that already had a person in employment. As to the concept of in-work poverty, I think we have to realize that really poverty is the leading idea. Poverty defines it. Poverty is the situation of the workers' households, and poverty is then defined by the needs of that household and the income of that household, and the needs depending on the household composition. So the number of adults and the number of children in the household, that defines whether a household is poor or not. And then in addition, part of their income can be obtained in the labor market. So part of the income may be labor earnings. This has certain implications. First, naturally, the definition of poverty will be very important. Here we use the 50% of the median. I'll be using the standard 60% that is in EU policy, also because you can easily get that out of the EU Silk data. And we have to realize that income that we're talking about is a different animal from earnings in the labor market. So it's annual in the first place, it's after tax, and it is equivalized for that household composition. So these are three things that are important to keep in mind. On the other hand, if we're talking about in-work poverty, we're talking about earnings, people having earnings. So if we like to compare it to low pay, we're talking about gross earnings. And to make it consistent with the household, we need to talk about annual earnings, and we also need to sum it up over the household members. Now, in turn, annual earnings result from the level of hourly pay times the hours worked during the year, and both are subject to different forces, and particularly hourly pay is usually the focus of talks about wage inequality. And then, so I think that's fair enough, but also the inequality of hours worked, I think, is particularly important. So as a result of all these things, individual earnings are not necessarily low in work poverty, poor households. So for instance, if you look at these simple US poverty lines, and they have a whole lot, then a household, one of their types, can even be poor while they would have $52,000 as an annual income, which is twice, on an annual basis, twice the low pay threshold. So you don't necessarily have to be low paid to be a poor household. It depends on your hours, depends on the other incomes, it depends on the taxation, and it depends on the composition of your household. So there is a lot of things that intervene between these earnings and household poverty. Now, I mentioned that there is a growing complexity. First, on the demographic side, households, the population of households is changing, and it's changing pretty rapidly in some countries, not in all, but in all the tendency is to have more singles. But in some countries, the share of singles has simply doubled over the last decades, and so up to 40 years of age, it might be a very substantial share of the household. So that's one thing, and then in that situation, we will have another trade-off between wages and hours and the poverty of your household, and in some of the other cases. The tax treatment, I already mentioned that, and I won't come back to that for now. And generally, as I said, the inequality of wages and the wage distribution focuses on pre-tax hourly pay, and certainly that in many countries is becoming more unequal than it was before. So there is a development going on there. And there is a very rapid growth in part-time work in some countries, and a slower growth, but mostly a relentless secular growth in part-time jobs in most countries. And that affects the distribution of working hours over individuals. And subsequently, that's the next point, also over households, together with the number of earnings, which I already mentioned with the diverging figure for the UK. More earners in households, different combinations of hours. So I think you can really state that the single breadwinner model has gone, and maybe has gone already a long time. While in the single breadwinner world, it's pretty easy what you earn in the labor market, because normally people would then, all these single breadwinners would be working 40 hours or 45 hours, so full-time a week, their annual earnings would almost directly reflect in the income distribution of their households. They would be the only one with an income, and what they would get in the labor market would be basically the income of the households. So that link, that simple link has entirely disappeared and become much more difficult to tell. And I think the literature has not entirely realized that difference. So if you're talking about approaches to income inequality on the one hand, or you're talking about wage inequality, earnings inequality in the labor market, basically they're two largely unconnected literatures. I'll show you a reference for that in the end. So I call that a tale of two literatures, and one of the things that I'm trying to do is to bridge that gap between the two, and part of it is what I'll be doing today. So again, to stress that low pay and the incidence of low pay is different from the incidence of in-work poverty, is that across this, so this is 2010, in all the European countries, with the EU 28 average to the left, you see that in all these countries, the incidence of low pay, so the share of workers who receive less than 2/3 of the median wage hourly, is much higher than that of the number of workers, or the share of workers in work poverty. Meaning that many of these other ones, these other low-paid ones, are either combining with other low-paid people and getting out of poverty, or they are with different paid people altogether, combining in households that were never poor. So I think that those things are pretty basic, but it's important to realize the implications of that. So what workers nowadays do is they scatter over different types of households. So single earner households, dual earner households, and multi-earner households, which in these figures on average would have 3.3 earners in a household, but there will be quite a diversity there, but I don't pay any attention to that today. If you look at that distribution, I will show you that in a minute, it's strongly skewed over the annual household earnings distribution, which I partly showed you indirectly with that first figure, where you find these main labor households in the income distribution. And at the same time, I would say the tectonics that I mentioned before, particularly of labor income moving up in the income distribution and going to the top, has a lot to do also with that combination of earnings in the household. So this figure shows you the three types of households that I mentioned. So the blue one, the large blue one in the northwest, for me it's northwest, like if I turn that way, the northwest corner is single earner households. There's only one earner in the household, so that may be single person households, but it may also be larger households. And you see that they're largely concentrated at the bottom of these 10 deciles of household earnings. So this is not a full income distribution, this is the distribution of households with a main income from labor ranked by the level of their annual aggregate earnings, and you see the distribution within each of these deciles. So single earners concentrate at the bottom, and dual earners are very important from, say, the 6th, 7th decile on, and particularly these multi-earners with 3 or more are rather important at the top end. So in the aggregate, 47% of all these households are single earners, 9% are multi-earners, and 45% are dual earners. And mind you, this is the EU average picture for 26 countries, so excluding Cyprus or Malta, but that won't make any difference. And it looks pretty much the same across these countries. So there are a few countries like Bulgaria or Romania where the role of multi-earner households is much larger than in some of the other countries. But basically, and that's what you see here, in Poland, it's not so much different. The multi-earners are a somewhat larger share than the 9% there, But at the same time, the single earners have at the top 10% instead of this average 15%, they have 22%. So they're more important in Poland compared to the picture. And I'll tell you why I say that there's not so much differentiation, because I was really amazed that it was, because my hunch was that it's very much a Western European line of thought, I think. Well, all this dual earning has grown and grown and grown, has become more important. But in Eastern Europe, that's what I realized, by definition, every two-adult household more or less was a two-earner household before the transition. So there it might have gone down, but the two meet more or less in the middle. And so there is very little variation in this distribution over the European countries, much less than I had expected. Now you can, so this discounts the households by deciles, discounts the workers in these households if you add up to 100%. So this is the full number of earners, of workers in these households, and you find where they are. So single earner households bring in only one earner each, while the dual earner households bring in two earners each. So you see that at the top 10, in the top 10 decile, 14% of all workers you find there. And at the bottom end, you find only 6% of all workers against, but that's employees only, again, in the EU average, with some, so the division there is naturally more skewed against single earners, as they count for only one. And here again, the Polish picture is very similar to the European average. So, if we have that situation that are many workers together in households higher up the income distribution, the question is how that works. What the effects are, not only how it works that they get there, I mean that's pretty logical, if you have more earnings then you will get higher up, but also what the effects on the rest of the distribution and on employment chances may be. So there what I see, but that's not a 100% picture for every possible worker in these households. But what I see developing, and what I think is more important in many countries than we might realize, is combination scenarios. So the additional earner in the household might have a different view on the job that they like to have. So there are often combinations of two full-time earners, but there are also many combinations where the first earner is full-time and the second is part-time. I'll show you that in a minute. And where the second earner may also be interested in a part-time job, so has a strong interest in there being part-time jobs, because that eases the combination with other things in life, like keeping the household okay, or pursuing an education. So there are combination scenarios where people have a strong interest in little commuting times, as little as possible, and also a timing that may be consistent with their other activities. And then such jobs are easily, well, they are found if they have a great geographical reach, which basically is in supermarkets, so in retail trade, or in hotels and catering, a bit less, but particularly in catering. And that's where many low-skilled jobs are. And the consequence that I see from that combination scenario is that people who are higher up the income distribution in Mr. Household, and often are also better educated, are a strong competing force for that type of jobs. And as a consequence, people for whom these jobs are in principle suitable, low-skilled people, are faced with the choice either doing it part-time if they can get it, because most of these jobs will be part-time as a consequence, or remain out of the labor altogether because they cannot make a living on such a job without working full-time. At the same time, I must say that also the additional earner for their particular dual or multi-earner households reduce the risk of poverty, I think. So I'll show you that as well. So this is an attempt to show, but it's only for the top 10 as an example, but that's the most diverging situation for dual and multiple and single earner households. It shows you here with the bars the average wage or the average annual earnings in these two types of households as a percentage of what a single earner in the same decile of earnings would earn. You can imagine that for a single earner household to get that high, the person must really be well paid. So they have high incomes, but if you look here at the bars, you see that these dual earner households have about half the earnings of on average of the single earner, and for the multiple earner households it's about a third. So what these households are actually doing is combining pay that's lower in the earnings distribution, combine that in their household, and as a consequence get up to higher levels in the total income or the total earnings of their households. There's a bit of the distribution indication, as I also showed with these single markers, what the main earner in those households would earn compared to the single earner in the same decile, and that's a bit higher, particularly for dual earners. So dual earners, I think, might be a bit of a different type, a different combination, more a higher earner and a really low earner in terms of annual earnings, while in the multiple earner household it might be more even between them. So there might be more there might be more full-time and low-paid work in those households. Now, I would have loved to show you the same picture of these households that I showed in the beginning, and then tell you how many people in these households are low-paid. But low pay on an hourly basis is not that easy to get in EU Silk. So here I return to an earlier exercise based on the ECHP before, so that's at the end of, that's around 2000. And this shows you, but for 3 particular countries, where you find low households that have at least one low-paid job in them across that. This is the distribution of incomes, I think, not the distribution of earnings. So this adds up to 100, all the households that have a low-paid earner in them. And you see that as a consequence, not only of that increased importance of dual and multiple earner households, but also because of that kind of combination scenarios, you find quite a lot of these people either working working both full-time or a combination of full-time and part-time, which is the red part of the bars, or only part-time both, which is very exceptional at the top, but there is some. You see how important that combination scenario of a full-timer and a part-timer in these 3 countries, the Netherlands, Germany, and Denmark is. So you can really be pretty sure that across the distribution of earnings, there you will find low-paid earners, which was an observation made for the minimum wage before. You can see it more precisely, but now again for 2009, for part-time work. So this combines. Here you find full-time dual earners, full-time multiple earners, full-time single earners, and then these 3 other parts are the part-timers in these same households. And what you can figure out here is that across the entire distribution you will find part-time workers up to the very top, and not a decreasing percentage. It's only at the very bottom that you find a higher percentage, because there are many quite likely young people who are single earners and working part-time, while over the rest there is a continued presence of part-time workers. And here for Poland, the total share of part-timers, which here for the EU average among households is some 22%, is a bit lower for Poland. but the spread over the distribution is the same. It goes on. It's only at the bottom end that you don't have that fanning out, which you find here. So all over the distribution, my conclusion is that you will find low-paid workers and you will find part-time workers. No, before I go there. So what I effectively saying is that people in that part, be they low-paid or be they working part-time, would be competing with labor supply in that lower end, the lower range of the earnings distribution, which it's a bit different formally from this, but they would be competing there with people at the low end of the earnings distribution, while they themselves would find them in better paid, better income circumstances. Now, at the same time, you must concede that a number of these the number of earners in a household has an important effect on the poverty rate among them. So the blue bars against are for single earners, they go up very high. So here we have the highest in Greece. There's more than 20%, and in Italy more than 20% of the single earners are poor households. Though they work, and the percentages are much lower, as you can see, for the other types of households. So it certainly has a contribution to make that people are combining their income. At the same time, that also makes policy making very difficult, because people not only have that strong interest in the combination scenarios and part-time work, but also they can say, well, we worked for it and we combined our income, so why would you tax us because we have a higher income? Yeah, we're working, we're putting more work in it. So it's not easy, I think, to find a kind of solidarity there easily with single earners. So for that reason, I think we need to think about how to deal with this policy-wise. So the first point also repeats what I said before. So this applies as much to the minimum wage as to lowering the taxation of the minimum wage, making it more net, or taking away the social contributions on these things. Because if you do that, and the Dutch government did that last year, so they made the tax credit that you get if you're in work dependent on your earnings, so to the advantage of the social, of the minimum wage. It was the idea that they would help the income distribution, but they don't, because the advantages will be spread all over the income distribution, so that's not a good thing to do. And the same holds for part-time work. Part-time work, in a sense, even if it's not low paid by the hour, is still quite likely low paid as an annual sum compared to the rest, thanks to the hours worked. So people might even trade off a higher hourly wage against the number of hours that they put in that. So these things really blunt the traditional redistributive tools. So in a single earner world, you could increase the minimum wage, and that would change the income distribution only for those at the low end who receive that minimum wage. But in this more complicated world, these policies are ineffective, and as long as you pursue them that way, with the idea that you would, as I just sketched, with the idea that you would improve the income distribution, most of the money is ill spent. You will be giving it to others, so there's a lot of deadweight loss in the sense of a target on more equal income distribution. So as I also said, the additional low-wage or part-time employment from these higher income households will diminish the employment chances or the hours chances for the low-skilled. Well, I think we should look for a mechanism that we can help these people in a cheaper way than with necessarily an increased wage or increased redistribution through taxes and tax credits. General tax credit. So therefore, I think, well, I myself thought, and I think many in the European debate, well, we cannot possibly afford an earned income tax credit because there are so many people in that part of the distribution. It was an important argument. But if you realize that you're spending your money on the entire distribution or you spend it only on part, then I think an EITC would be a much more cheaper and a much more effective way to help those households who can at best get a part-time job or a very low-paid job, or the two together. So I think if we're talking about social policies for the labor market to diminish its inequality effects, we should be very serious about an earned income tax credit. At the same time, I think that puts a different light on a minimum wage. If you have no minimum wage, then the employer will quite likely be getting the advantage of the EITC. He knows that or she knows that the worker will get EITC to top up the income, so why bother? So an adequate minimum wage will be a tool for government to limit the expenditure on the one hand, and at the same time it can still serve fairness in the workplace. All these other things you can, but you're more free to do the other things. Now it's all burdened with redistributive effects. Well, then you can liberate yourself and think, well, what would be the optimal minimum wage from the point of view of its effects on productivity in the long run, or its effects on fairness and cooperation in the workplace. So you're more free to determine the minimum wage, while at the same time you will weigh it against the cost of the EITC. And I would like to conclude with the idea that now is the chance for the EU, now that Germany has introduced the minimum wage, why not say that every country in the EU, that they agree that they should have a minimum wage or something adequate, like an adequate replacement, like in Sweden or Denmark, but maybe not in Italy, given that long tail of people are paid below the minimum wage, and then also couple it with an EITC. Now there will be important differences in tax systems, so that's not something that you can do overnight, but I think you should be very seriously thinking about it and not just discuss the minimum wage in isolation, but take it together with the effect that it can have in that way. And there I'll stop. And I'll show you, so the Gini project is at the bottom, and then if you're interested in a good overview of in-work poverty literature, then take a look at a book by Eric Cretas, or his recent paper, I think, in the Journal of European Social Policy last year. And much of that things that I just showed you, the distribution of these household types over the earnings distribution, you can find in that chapter, and the Tale of Two Literatures is in that handbook chapter. Thanks.